Welcome to Block Time with Riot. I'm here today with our head of construction, Lyle Theriot. Lyle is, I think you're a legend twice over because you helped build the biggest Bitcoin mining facility and you're doing it again. And so there's really, the number of people with that.
It's limited.
So, yeah, it's very limited. So thanks for coming on to Riot's new podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us.
Sure, absolutely.
I think that like what I did in the last episode with Jason was really start from the beginning in Bitcoin mining of, what caused you to drop into this crazy world and kind of your journey since that.
Sure. So my journey with Bitcoin started back in Louisiana, back in New Orleans, actually. This was the Whinstone era. I ended up meeting somebody there who started the company with me and just took me down the rabbit hole that I think a lot of people go down through when they get into Bitcoin, which was, hey, check out this white paper. And then the other side was, hey, if you plug these things in, they just make money. So it's like really enticing. It's pretty easy to get caught up into. So went down that path and decided to mine Bitcoin. So we ended up building, this is like 2017, 2018 timeframe, in New Orleans, Louisiana. We ended up building a Megawatt. Inside of, I had fitness facilities at the time, CrossFit gyms. We built a Megawatt inside of one of the gyms.
What better place for proof of work than a gym?
Yeah. It's funny, the synergies there. It's like increased work capacity across broad time and modal domains, and then proof of work, and like it's funny the similarities across that mode of thinking. So that drew me absolutely. To it as well. Mm-hmm.
The other parallel. I'll bring up because I had somebody criticize Bitcoin mining of like, you're wasting all these hashes. You're only finding one winning hash every 10 minutes, and these trillions of other hashes are going to waste. And I was like, if you're training for the Olympics and you're lifting weights and running around the track, is that wasted because hey, there's only 100 meters you need to sprint, right? Which is the day of the Olympics.
Yeah.
But you had to do all of this work in order to get to that. So the similarities there.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think where you end up when we talk about efficiency, we always get back to this conversation about optimization. And I think it's a really cool synergy between the two in that, like, sometimes it's counterintuitive to think that you're wasting energy or you're wasting this work, when a lot of times the most efficient gains that you can pick up is just optimizing what you already have, right? And I think we see that a lot in our sites, and then you see that in the fitness realm as well.
Yeah, and I think the other parallel is everyone has an opinion.
Yeah, that's probably the big takeaway for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so 1 megawatt. And air-cooled divers.
Yeah. We built this big. It was basically like a big bookshelf. It's funny. I did like a video one day where I just climbed it to show everybody that it was sturdy, and and we built it out of wood
with S9s.
S9s, yeah. We purchased a couple hundred S9s, and back then you had to the only way to get a machine was to send Bitcoin, obviously to China, and then it was like I'll never forget Ashton. Driving like his Vespa to the bank to go wire the money to China for machines, and they're like, "What is this for?" And it's like computer parts, right? Because nobody understood. Like you couldn't tell them it was Bitcoin miners. They'd be like, "What are you talking about?" Just the means of getting the device before you even have to run it in a hot environment or something was pretty difficult. So,
the wood it seems flammable.
Yeah, a little combustible for sure. But like R&D wise, great, right? Because you can cut it really quick on site, and you can like piece something together. I had a carpenter that worked for me at the time, and just built like a big bookshelf. He's like, "What are you gonna do with this?" I was like, "Don't worry about it, just build this." And I think it's funny. I actually did a presentation last week for the company, and part of the theme of the presentation was I showed like hand sketches from people and how we get from that to the final product. And I thought that was a fun nod back to this story from Louisiana too, because we basically had to build something new. So everything we did, we had to start with something like wood or something easier to work with, because there was no place to go like buy a Bitcoin mining shelf, and like these server racks didn't do the job for us. So it seems to be a theme that continues to today for sure.
Yeah, and how was the electrical side on that 1 megawatt facility?
It was interesting. We had this infamous panel there where we couldn't decide exactly where to install it on the wall because we were moving things around and trying things out. So we attached the electrical panel to a piece of plywood, and then we would just move it around with like a big flexible cable on it. And turns out that's not like the safest way to do it, and there's some considerations there. But again, we learned a lot of lessons in the heyday.
Awesome. And so y'all got to, was it 1 megawatt of capacity that you were building towards, or is that just like y'all got to 1 megawatt?
Yeah, good question. It's funny. It started out as, okay, I think they had about 5 or 6 machines when I met Ashton, and then it was we did like some really complex math, right? We were like, okay, wait, if we buy 10, well, hang on, if we buy 25, and then it just became, how many can we fit in this building? And we always had the joke, we had other businesses at the time, and this was kind of a part-time thing, and it was the joke about like they never call in sick. Right. You just plug. So it was, I think we got a little bit captured by that story, and basically just called the power company. It was like, how much power can we get here? And they're like, we have a 1 megawatt transformer we can bring. So we're like, how many machines is that? And that's basically how the decision was made.
I see. Yeah. Just
maximize. Yeah.
That's not that different from how it's done today.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. Yeah, not much has changed for sure.
So with that 1 megawatt, where is it now? Did y'all spin it down when you moved to Texas?
Yeah. So we ended up building around 5, 6, 7 megawatts in Louisiana. That's about our peak capacity that we got to, and then eventually we found ourselves in Texas, over at the old Alcoa plant in Rockdale, our big site now. And we moved everything from Louisiana to Texas and actually installed those S9s there. Yep.
Got it. Wow. Okay. What a journey. And why did y'all end up moving to Texas? What was kind of the thought process there?
Sure. Yeah. So we had, back in those days, we really operated sort of like a general contractor for people in the Bitcoin space. So the jump there from us doing our own mining up to a megawatt to finding a client, we saw this opportunity where we could only build so much power with the money we had, right? And to take the next step to go past a megawatt, we were getting into like uncharted territory. To go raise money and then be really like, to be able to just afford the machines was sort of past our capability at the time. But we saw this opportunity where there were companies with the money, with the ability and the resources to go buy these machines, but no way to be able to run them in a hot environment like where we were, where all the power is cheap. It tends to be in the hotter environments, the power tends to be a little cheaper. So we capitalized on that, and we ended up getting a big Japanese client to fund the project, and then we built it for them. And then basically maximizing that capacity in Louisiana, we got to a point where it just made more sense if we were going to take the next step to go into the 50 and 100 megawatt scale, that we needed to find better infrastructure. Connecting these devices, even at 7 to 10 megawatts, that is massive scale for like an urban area or something. You're talking about like you need politicians to help you push a permit through or something, right? And you have to really go and engage. Whereas when we looked in Texas, it was like, oh, there's an aluminum plant that's shuttered, and there's hundreds of megawatts just of capacity as far as infrastructure waiting to be used. So that's what really led us to that decision to expand there.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's like a stranded asset.
Yeah.
That's just like
stranded infrastructure is how we think about go to where it is a lot easier.
And so I think that from seeing the site to deciding, okay, this is where we're going to really bet the whole company on, right? Because it was kind of a one site deal. What was the thought process? Did you have did you ever have like moments of buyer's remorse of like seeing a different site and being like, oh, maybe we should have gone here instead? Yeah.
So I think something that has persisted through this entire journey for me, at least, is, and it's easy to forget, but it's this time domain that we operate in. there is almost no time to even like second guess these decisions or think too hard about it, which I think actually helps when you're going for scale. But not only did we have to go to sort of a place we had never been and try to negotiate, these power contracts and these assets, but we had to sell our companies and really make a big transition in our personal lives to get there too. So it felt a little bit like sort of burning the ships. Yep. Right. And we were all in on this, and I guess we saw the potential, but we didn't have time to think too hard about what the repercussions would be if we failed. And I think that was actually part of our strength, was just leaning in and saying our only option is to survive and get through this. And I think there were quite a few times in the history of the company where I think a lot of people would have walked away when it got hard, when it got tough. Yeah. And I think the fact that we had committed 100%, got us through it.
Yeah, just skin in the game.
Yeah,
there's no turning back at that point.
Yeah.
And so from there, when you saw Rockdale and the former Alcoa plant, what size did you have in mind? Like, did you have in mind a 700 megawatt facility, or was it like, oh, okay, well, a 50 is huge now, right? From Louisiana.
Yeah. So we were jumping from that 7 megawatt range, and most of our conversations were around 50 to 100 megawatts. That's what the client wanted at the time, and that's what they were willing to, help us with some capex to get built. And when you jump from like an urban area trying to like operate on a grid that's connected to a bunch of commercial and homes around, the scale is so different. When we got to the Alcoa site up there, they were used to this terminology around hundreds of megawatts. And the first tie we negotiated there was a 750 megawatt tie. So I think it was more of a learning curve for us, understanding like, oh, we can think a little bigger about this and explore more clients and more resources to put towards this at a bigger scale. So I think we fell into it a bit. We were looking for 50 to 100 megawatts, and we found 750. Yeah.
Got it. And so then from there, that determined the thought process going forward of the capacity of the size of the facility, how much land.
Yeah, I wish I could say it was that straightforward, because obviously, it's a business and it unfolded over years. And I remember negotiating the Alcoa site. We initially started, we were going to retrofit and remodel some of their existing pot room smelter buildings. And that didn't work out. So we found a greenfield location on the property. And I guess your thought process is, no matter what, the power's there, which was the main part, right? That was the thing that was difficult to find, was the power in that volume available at the right price as well, too. And that goes into the electricity market that we operate in. But I think we took a lot of we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to find the power. It didn't really matter too much what the site looked like. We figured we could make it work. We could tear down a building, we could rebuild. If it's a greenfield, which is what we found, we said, hey, we'll level it and we'll put some buildings up. And I think that attitude helped us to be able to not get too caught up in how we were going to operate, and more so just stay focused on what was actually important, which was that electrical capability of that site was the important part. And we'll figure out how to build around that.
And so when you pulled up, this was just a forest.
Yeah, basically, it was just a bunch of trees. And then it's funny, I'm from southern Louisiana, like below I-10. So I'm used to very low-lying flat lands. And when we started clearing all the trees from the Rockdale site, all of a sudden these hills popped up. And I was like, oh my gosh, we have all this site work to do. So I think obviously we've evolved from there, and we've gotten much better with planning and developed our capabilities. But back then, to think that, we were really kind of flying by the seat of our pants. But I think it's so common in this industry. Like at that time, we were doing something that was so abnormal. Like to go open a bank account at that time was so difficult to explain the business case around what we were doing. The fact that we weren't completely penciled out in our planning sort of fit the narrative and the vibe of what we were doing. So I think for us, it was just, solving problems and having fun and getting things done. So
what would you say, were some of the biggest problems y'all had to solve arriving in Rockdale?
Goodness. Okay, so if I had to pick a couple, number one, the hills were a bit of a challenge. We lucked out and we found some really good contractors that can move tons of dirt. Yeah. So we really lucked out with services there. Actually connecting. So I think a lot of people maybe don't have a good understanding of exactly what it takes to be able to, one, be qualified to, and then two, to physically connect to like a large interconnect, like a 700 megawatt interconnect. all of the like regulations and all of the licenses and all of the qualifications we had to work through to be able to do that was like mind-boggling. You're operating at the level now of like a massive power plant, and you're, you know, a couple people that were mining Bitcoin in Louisiana a year ago. So I think that that learning curve was very steep for us, and we just, you know, whether it was luck or fate or whatever, we found some really good help in that process with our power providers and our consultants to help us work through that. Especially because we were so, you know, we're kind of innocent back then. We didn't know a lot about the scale of these things and what was required, but we got there. So,
And you know, for those challenges, what was like what kept you going and what kept the team going? Right? Was it bullishness on Bitcoin, or just having fun with like, hey, we're building an industrial scale, a power plant equivalent?
Yeah, so a couple things. I'd say that the thing that dug us out of the hole, right, was at the end of the day, we had a group of people that we had built relationships with, and they had also, you know, burned their ships and like committed everything to this for us to go towards this goal. And I think we held each other accountable. And when it got really dark and really dismal and we thought, oh my gosh, we're not going to make it to Wednesday type of deal, what got us through was like, well, if I leave, like I'm letting all these people down. So I think that was probably number one. Outside of that, it was helpful to be able to lean on the fact that we were building something really cool and fun that hadn't been done before. So I think that, you know, it's important to note the power of that for us to constantly remind ourselves that we get to, you know, kind of take some credit or have some ownership in like creating something new. I think we still have a really creative group. So that filled that kind of need for us. And then outside of that, we're building a business. And I think anytime you're growing from like a garage with a few people to like a big, eventually a public company, those challenges, while they can seem really mundane, right, can be so challenging. They can be really engaging about like, how do I develop, you know, an organization and an HR department and like all these different pieces to a company to become an official professional company? That process, at least for me, was really fun and really challenging. And, you know, one of our first clients was Japanese. So the culture there was very like, I remember them asking where every single component, like when it came in, where it was installed, who installed it, how much time it took. So that forced us to build these systems and processes that really helped us grow, not only as people, but as a company. So.
Yeah, on the first point about, you know, those relationships you built, it reminds me of like a World War II movie where it's like it's not about me, it's not about the country, it's like about the guys to my left and right in the trenches, you know, who have families back home, and it's like, okay, I want to bring them home alive. And you know, not to liken it too much to military service, but that's I think that's the vibe where like y'all were literally in trenches, right? Like, you know, out there building the site.
Yeah, we physically moved there, and I think we lived out of our trucks for like a minute. I remember going to McDonald's for Wi-Fi. It was like constant until eventually, you know, we kind of bootstrapped and snuck into some office area that we could borrow for a period of time because it was a greenfield. There was like, you know, a portable toilet on the site, and that was about it, and then dirt everywhere. So we didn't even have like the amenities to necessarily run a company. But we did it, you know, sitting in our truck on the Wi-Fi, and then we did it with people who also moved, you know, from all over the country. You know, some of the guys moved from northeast, northwest, and helped us out there and left their family, left their friends to do it. So yeah, 100%, we were in the trenches together, and that really helped, I think, through some of those darker times where we were just so uncertain. I mean, I remember Bitcoin just going like so low during this period where not only is it hard to raise money on something, you know, like what we were doing, something so aggressive, but we were doing it in the Bitcoin space, and every time Bitcoin took a dip, like we maybe lose a meeting, right? That was to go raise some more money to keep going. So yeah, but
I mean, it's so many companies just don't survive the bear market, right? And those who do survive the bull market, I think that there's a selection bias, right? Of like, okay, well, not only are they going to outperform because they've got great people, but also you can look at the history and you see that they survived a bear market or two or three, right? So there's resilience in the business model that's not predicated on just massive amount of leverage or, you know, unrealistic expectations about, frankly, about Bitcoin, right? Which everyone wants to be bullish on, but at the end of the day, the bull market does have a ceiling on it, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we had to really lean on that as we built the company because we didn't have any of the other credentials. So we had never run like a massive company or handled all these hundreds of millions of dollars. So we had to lean on our experience, which was all basically the fact that we had done something before, right? So we constantly showed how we iterated all of our processes and our systems. So yeah, that was like a key component in us being able to, get the funds to complete the project. So we lean on that very heavily, for sure.
When I think about today in the Bitcoin mining space, 1 to 7 megawatts is still a lot today, especially like no hobbyist is doing that, right? Like they might be literally in their garage or heating their pool with a fraction of that, but that was already enterprise scale, business scale.
Yeah, I think we get a little desensitized to the scale because we're constantly talking about hundreds of megawatts. And it takes we had an email come through a couple weeks ago about I think it was like a geothermal cooling technique that's used in a bunch of data centers around the world. And the engineer replied back to our capacity email saying, hey, I think you made a mistake here. You're 5 times the heat density of a typical data center. And we're like, no. We've checked the math. Yeah. And it's I think even it's again, the learning curve is part of this is that's our number one weapon on all these things is we've actually done it at scale. And we understand the nuances that go along with that, which is some of it's counterintuitive.
So when you started building, at Whinstone and Rockdale, you mentioned, so you got up to having Wi-Fi at McDonald's. Yeah. Eventually, you got some portables out there and laying out. Did you do one building at a time, or did you do in parallel the first 2 buildings?
Yeah, so basically the first build we did was 2 buildings out there and a substation. So we built about, I think it was a 300 megawatt substation. We had the big 200 that's out there and the other 100. And that was starting from trees, right? So we cleared some trees, we leveled the land, and then we immediately started on a workshop area. And this is something I do wish we did a better job capturing, images and videos of this, but the workshop that's still up there in Rockdale today had 60 people in it at any time, just cranking out these systems. It was a shelving system that we designed and built in-house. I literally drew it on a napkin one day and figured out how to build the shelving system to hold all these components. So that was probably, outside of putting up the building and making sure the foundation and electrical got built right, putting the racking together was such a big part. That and getting rid of the boxes. That was also another, monumental feat for us. But I think looking at the site now and how we build, you can tell we've learned from it. But back then, thinking through that process, it was as simple as we have to hire 130 local workers that maybe are skilled, but they don't have the skills we necessarily need for the work we're doing. But we also have to build this thing that hadn't been built before. So we, if you remember our first 2 buildings out there, we actually made all the shelving out of strut. And the design part of it was there was only one measurement and one cut on the whole thing. So it was so that someone could sit there and push a button and cut the strut, and then someone could come after them. A group of 6 people could screw everything in and bolt it all together, and then bring it down and then install it on the slab really quickly. So I think outside of the fact that it's a pretty weird project that hadn't been done a lot, especially at this scale or maybe ever, we did it very fast. So that first building, from the time we broke ground and started moving dirt to turning on the first miner, it was 181 days, I believe, is that. So yeah. I think if anybody has experience in the construction realm, that's very fast, especially for a new thing. And we also built the whole substation in that time and interconnected. So we had so many sort of lines of things going on, and of course problems in all areas that we were constantly attacking. But I can't tell you how many times I remember just sitting on the concrete slab, helping them put the shelving up and thinking what have we gotten ourselves into? And then just kind of, trucking towards that light at the end of the tunnel.
We had our house built, and I think it took 18 months.
Oh, yeah.
It's
there you go. Good. Yeah,
it's just it's night and day. I mean, I imagine if we had a crew just focused 100% on the house, right? You can, but it's phenomenal. The speed, which I mean, is necessary. In Bitcoin mining, every 10 minutes counts.
This gets missed a lot. I think one, I think we have a pretty good appreciation for how fast we work. I think we always have to remind ourselves on how fast we have to work. That's something that I think when we do this equation in our minds or in a model, we we try to take the typical approach on like risk management and how we're going to like associate these things and what decisions we're going to make. And then at the end, we always have this like penciled in factor that's like every 10 minutes. And it changes your decision making. It really does. And it makes the site look different and it makes things work different. I think for the better. I like to move fast and break things and figure out how to make it. I think we develop a lot faster. We learn faster that way. But I think people coming into the industry from outside, like maybe a traditional construction environment or development, it's easy to miss that piece, which is you can make a ton of decisions around building a better product and miss, 6 months of Bitcoin mining at scale,
Right.
and like not understand that you could have rebuilt the facility in that time with the funds that you would have captured. So I think
That's why we call the podcast block time.
there you go.
Like every 10 minutes. And so I think, the sense of urgency is like just a core part of the culture and the values of the company, which I think it makes it more interesting for folks. Like, working at a company where things don't happen quickly, it can be exhausting. It's not as motivating as being here at Riot.
Yeah, we had a joke last week in the town hall where someone asked about if we had planned for this new expansion in Corsicana, if we had planned the development to line up around the halving, which is coming up next year. And I chuckled a little bit, right? Because we know that almost all the decisions we make are based just in like our ability to get raw materials because of the scale we operate at. It's like how much copper is coming through that shipping channel that determines how many, of these devices we can get. But so to think that we had like the foresight to try to plan a development around the halving was kind of funny. But then to think every meeting we've had for the last 3 months has been the halving is coming up. How do we speed up and how do we catch up to be able to get some Bitcoin mined before that halving happens? So I think that's another fun relationship with the timing and why behind our pressure and our urgency and the need for that.
It reminds me, somebody was explaining why Apple does such a great job of shipping products, and they pointed to the fact that you had this forcing function of they have an annual conference where the CEO is going to announce the product. And so it has to be ready to go before that date. And I think it helps bring everything into focus. So now the halving's every 4 years. But hey, look, the difficulty adjustment is every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Like we should be talking about, hey, are we going to get Corsicana done this week? Right? Because we got a difficulty
adjustment. It's a good point. I was always like, can we just push the halving back?
Right.
Give me some more time to build the thing.
It's funny with when the first halving happened in 2012, there were miners talking about like, hey, do we need this as part of Bitcoin? But sure enough, we do.
True.
Okay, so so I'm imagining the Japanese client was pretty happy about the speed.
Yeah. I think we did a great job, and it turned into more clients. And I think this is where we transition from sort of what we built in Rockdale to the next phase of the company, which is where we met Riot, and they came in and purchased the company. And we're so thankful to still be here, right? Especially the core group that built up a lot of that site. And I think Riot saw that. So a lot of outside of the cultural meshing and the fact that we had similar cultures at the company, and we agreed sort of intrinsically about a lot of things and how we wanted to operate a business. I think they recognized how quickly we were able to build, especially in a market that was maybe not the most conducive. We started the 400 megawatt expansion for Riot in Rockdale in 2020, like January 2020. I'll never forget hiring like over 150 people in a 2-month span, and then like sending them all home for 2 weeks so that we could collect gloves and hand sanitizer and all the things we needed. So I think like not only did we do it like extremely fast, but we did it with everything against us, right? Bitcoin was like really going down, and the entire like economy was kind of on the fritz. And we still like stuck in there with our trench mates, right? And like got the thing done no matter what came at us. And I think we built that resilience over time, and it's only shown itself as we deliver. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that, with COVID and kind of the supply chain issues too around that, did that affect some of the decision-making day to day?
It's like, I want to say yes, but I don't. I think because of back to that time domain with like it's as fast as possible, right? I will say like we learned, we we breached another learning curve, which was like big business, right? Like when you're ordering tens of millions of dollars of supplies from suppliers and manufacturers, whenever you like place that order and then get a force majeure letter the next day, you learn some things. You're like, okay, well, hang on a second, how do we handle this and I think the lesson that we learned there was it's all about relationships. It's similar to the trenchmate sort of thing we're talking about, where we didn't sort of step back onto our heels or get defensive and try to like go forward and like attack our vendors. And we understood like everybody's in the same position. We're dealing with these limitations, and we tried to build better relationships with them. And I can't tell you how many times that's paid off where maybe nobody could get product,
right,
and we could. And it's because one, we paid on time, which helped, but two, we took the time to develop those relationships and help them understand that, hey, we're not, some weird, crazy guys in the woods trying to mine Bitcoin. Like, we're a legitimate company and we want to do business.
And so on the air-cooled side, I know that, so there was kind of the institutional hosting, and then Riot's air-cooled. Although Whinstone was self-mining as well at that point.
We didn't have any self-mining.
Okay.
We didn't do any self-mining.
And so as the air-cooled buildings evolved, like what changed in kind of your approach to those buildings?
Yeah, sure. So the first two buildings we did there for that client was all air-cooled. Those are those strut racks we talked about. We had been watching the immersion space since the inception, since 2017, 2018. I remember going on YouTube and like finding some like crazy Russian guy on his rooftop with fish tanks doing these machines and just being excited about it. Like, oh my gosh, this is the future. Yeah. How do we make this work? And then, we'd explored and realized, it's really expensive and there are no products off the shelf, especially nothing at our scale. So we were building in the 100 megawatt range per deployment at this point. And like the biggest immersion tank you could get was like, a couple kilowatts. And then, they could make you one every 3 months or something. And it was very expensive. So we saw that and then continued to work on it. We even had like a fish tank in our office filled with mineral oil, the old school way, right? And we'd run some S9s in there. But by the time Riot came along and we started the 400 megawatt deployment, we brought it to the table. We said, hey, we think now's an opportunity for us to look at this technology seriously and take a chance and take a risk. And I think, we had, as far as like, so Whinstone is integrating with Riot at this point, and we had 160 employees. So we were kind of a big force, right? And we understood the build process, and we were championing this kind of risk on like, we think it's going to pay off. We think that this is the future and we want to be a leader in it. And
what led you to that conclusion?
I think just trying it, right, and doing it. We had looked at a bunch of different solutions from different vendors, and what we found was, one, it was pretty simple in the sense that, like, well, number one, we're pretty familiar with like transformers and how we cool those, and it's a similar process, right? It's a dielectric fluid that they circulate. So we understood the physics behind it, and we were like, okay, this isn't a very complicated process. All of the problems were around scale on the vendor side, or even on our side, which was, how do you make the tank fit these devices that change every couple of years? So that was like some of the considerations. How do you get all the power into that tank? Because the products on the market were to feed normal servers. These things were like 3,500 watts. So like a lot of power had to be in each tank. So outside of like designing the tank and the power in the system, it was, okay, now how do I put 30,000 of these machines in one building in like some footprint that works operationally, where people aren't climbing on ladders, or like, and like a place that works and we can scale with a couple hundred people. So I think we basically were able to sift through like what the real problems in the market were. And it was almost all helping vendors build a business around supply chain and being able to get the materials they need to build the systems at scale and deliver us, 1,000 units every 3 months instead of 10. And then also just like helping them work through how we thought about our sites and the power distribution and matching those two up. And I think we did a really good job there. I think the largest deployment of Immersion at the time was maybe a couple megawatts, and we did 200 megawatts in our first deployment. And it's funny, the CEO of ESS Metron, who was with us from the start, Stephen Howell, will tell you about our meetings with Midas in that first engagement. And the initial talk was around 10 megawatts, and they were like a little hesitant, right? Like, that's a big deployment. And then we got them to 20. And if you can do 20, you can do 50.
Right.
And then it evolved. Eventually, we do 200 with them. And you don't get there in those conversations with real business people who've been doing business for a long time, who understand risk, and they risk their whole company to do this deployment with us without developing a relationship and helping them understand why we were doing it, and that we were going to be there to help and support. And I think that was, again, that showed in the result in that we deployed 200 megawatts, and it's relatively stable. From never being done before.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, so before and currently in those air-cooled buildings, we're using that evaporative cooling approach. And then now with the immersion, it's really centered around using the dry coolers outside, which are also a whole, beast of their own, right? These industrial scale dry coolers. I mean, do you want to talk about like the difference of efficiency between evaporative air cooling and then immersion with dry coolers?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, I will say air versus liquid, right?
Yeah.
Is kind of an easy way maybe to think about the two systems that we've deployed recently. I think like I try to stray a little bit away from any kind of like metrics or statistics around these things because one, it's not that complicated, and two, like we're using a lot of off-the-shelf items. You do some math and you can figure out an efficiency point that these things theoretically should operate at. I think where you end up at this scale, if you're building a business around it, is how are you going to operate these things long term? And I think those metrics around efficiency would really matter. So when we think about like servicing an air-cooled facility, we have to build vertically to be able to get the density. That means I need a scissor lift or some mode to be able to get a worker up there and service the device. Also, all of my infrastructure is really tall. So, there's like all these safety considerations we have to take in that design and that deployment and on the operational side. When you go to immersion, everything we do is single level. So you can literally a worker can walk around the site and then just pick up a machine out of the bath and service it. So I think like those metrics that we get from that, or that efficiency is actually more important than the cooling side, and it's going to trump it long term. And obviously, like all the cooler vendors or all of the immersion vendors can tell you, right, that on paper it's more efficient to run these systems. It's relatively simple. You've got a pump and you've got a cooler outside. On the other end, you're running fans, right, to cool the system. So I think that's how I look at it. A little more of like you got to be realistic about. It's not just about building it and deploying it and pressing a button and it works as described. It's like you're going to have to service this thing long term.
And I mean, human time is like the scarcest asset in the world, right?
There you go.
There's nothing scarcer than that.
It's important to consider for sure.
And safety. And then, I mean, I imagine it also just makes it faster in terms of setting things up that you're not having to go on the scissor lift.
Yeah. So we're I think, on my end of things, we're a little biased to the construction, right? So like we do our best to think of the operations of the facility, but we put a lot of weight on actually being able to build and deploy it too. So we've basically, like from the electrical system to the cooling systems, we've made it all modular. So everything is basically, let's say a somewhat complex system, but we do it 100 times for each deployment. So I think that helps, and that also comes back to we employ the people that install these things. So we're back to like, how do we do it in a safe way? And how do we make it easy? Because we're dealing with high voltage electricity and like heavy machines and a lot of heat and all these things. So yeah, I think those outside of maybe just the broad physics that govern whether the machine's gonna cool more efficiently between air and liquid, there's so many more considerations that go into it. And I think long term we're gonna see the results of that. And I think liquid looks pretty promising.
How would you compare kind of the power density between those two?
So let's say when we built Rockdale, pretty similar. If you look at the footprint, we're like right around 60,000 square feet, let's call it roughly, for 100 megawatts in air. And then we're around 80,000 for a liquid immersion of 100 megawatts. We're pretty close to passing up air with the liquid immersion systems now, especially with the newer devices that are coming out. So we're able to run significantly more machines or put more power in a smaller footprint and run more devices there. But the
despite being at ground level,
even with one layer,
yeah,
exactly, and we're not 20 feet in the air, so we get the operational stuff and the safety benefit from it as well. And I think a lot of this industry, as far as mining, is so based on like the hardware manufacturers and how they change things. So that shows you like we could have spent all of our time on this cooling infrastructure and picking up efficiencies there. And it's like somebody releases a device that picks up 10 times and doesn't require all the pieces. So I think that's a really, that's where you're going to see most of the change for sure.
Yeah. So when you heard, when you selected Corsicana and 1 gigawatt, like where did your mind go in terms of, okay, what's, the vision for the site? And do you feel like that that vision is being fulfilled, or has it evolved?
Sure. Yeah. So to answer it directly, I'd say evolved and ever evolving. And I think this has been like a really fun place for me to sit in on and be a part of conversations at a high level and think about what we're going to do with the place that we bought in Corsicana. Initially, it was pretty straightforward. So I don't know anybody else with 1,000 megawatt tie in this industry. So that was like a draw, right? And we spend a lot of time, just like we do on the construction side and everywhere. Everything we do is like, we try to keep this stuff as simple as possible because we have pretty limited resources and bandwidth sometimes. And that site up there basically checked a bunch of boxes for us, but also we leaned on the power companies, and we talk a lot with ERCOT, and we want to have good relationships with our regulators. We wanted to go where everybody wanted us to go. So that was another draw to that site. Was we're not picking some place where we're gonna maybe cause some congestion, or as if that could be a thing, but we wanted to pick the site where the people who regulate us and sell us power wanted us to be. That would be conducive to their operations and reliability and stuff like that. So I think just those two things there is we can achieve, one, owning a little bit more of our destiny. We're going to own the property up there, and then owning that 1,000 megawatt tie was like two really interesting concepts to meal on for the company. Yeah. So, and as far as how it's going, I think you don't always get the best of all worlds. So we've got the power and we're in the right spot, and then we looked at the site and it's like, oh my gosh, we have to cut like I think it was almost 1 million yards of dirt to be able to flatten the thing and be able to make it give us the ability to build on it. So I would say a really challenging construction project from the civil standpoint. But we've done it. So I think we've gotten that experience now of being able to do it. I think that's really.
So I think that the people who love dump trucks and construction equipment, they'd love to hear about the civil engineering that we did on that site to make it, world-class data center property.
Yeah, huge. So, I mean, there was the topography of the site when we got there there was a significant, hilly slope down to a river, basically, and it required us to cut. I think it was 850,000 yards was our first cut and fill out there to flatten the property. And I hope we get to layer in some pictures here so people can kind of. It's also
Producer
one of those
Gabe's
things.
on it.
Yeah, I think I wish I had the numbers on hand of like how many dump trucks that is, but it's breathtaking, right? Like how much dirt we had to move and place on the site to be able to get it to where we needed it. Yeah, I think monumental, and then we did it really fast, and that leans back to like we're still using contractors that have helped us on the very first clearing that we did in Rockdale, that we built relationships with over, and they've developed their companies alongside us, and now when we call them, they can send 15 tractors with pans on it to move all the dirt because they understand these guys need to go fast, right? Because we're in the Bitcoin. We're in the Bitcoin space. So I think that is one of the reasons we're able to do it. And then secondly, just from a construction standpoint, it's worth seeing. It's just so impressive, the scale of all the things we do. And you don't really appreciate it till you get out there and you look at it.
Yeah, that reminds me that like we often overlook how many jobs Bitcoin mining creates, not just directly, which is hundreds at Riot, but then indirectly in all the full supply chain of all the inputs from the civil engineering, moving dirt onto, construction contractors, electrical equipment manufacturers. Now we have ESS Metron. Yep. And then, of course, the actual Bitcoin mining rig manufacturers that, MicroBT, we announced that we're going to be working with them. They're building domestically, which is fantastic for our supply chain. But how what do you think has been the impacts on the local communities that we operate in and kind of the economic and social activities we bring?
Sure. So I get to spend a bunch of time on this, which is one, it's a little scary sometimes, right? Because I think we happen to operate in these rural communities, and a lot of times there's there's a bit of a learning curve again to traverse with the community around what we do. And there's a lot of people out there saying we do weird stuff, right? And don't understand that we're just like a pretty normal company for the most part. We build cool things and we have fun and we do good business. But I deal with it basically on a per site basis. So with Rockdale, we've got some pretty good numbers that have come out as far as our impact. We win a bunch of awards all the time. We're the largest employer in the county there. We just recently did an impact study for Navarro County up in Corsicana, and I think the indirect jobs, or the total with direct and indirect, is over 800 job impact just for Navarro County. So I think, yeah, I mean, me looking at those big numbers, it's kind of like the power numbers, right? We can get a little desensitized to it, but that's real impact. That's real people that we're helping.
Those are numbers in a rural community. Like, so if you live in New York City, you might think, oh, 800, you know, that's one building.
One building or something, yeah.
But this, you know, and it's families, right? I mean, it's a whole, I think that I see it as like revitalizing rural America that frankly has been left behind by the dollar policies of, hey, we're going to export treasuries instead of exporting aluminum or, you know, real resources.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, you know, I think as a company, we're constantly like evolving and growing, and it still feels really young to me, you know, sitting in some of these meetings and seeing it's so like, especially like our executive staff, they're so good about having their hands sort of all over the place and they're very involved, and we get to participate in some of that. It helps to remind me that we don't have all the answers of exactly where we're going, but we're starting to formulate sort of these values as a company and how we operate. So I think, like, at least when I look at the industry, there's a bunch of ways that we can operate these facilities, right? We could build in some, like maybe some automation and run with less employees, but then like there's all these trade-offs that come with that. And I think, at least on my end, I've always operated from like giving someone or providing someone the opportunity to have a job and to build something for themselves or build a career at the company. It puts so much impact on the community and their family, and then also wanting their kids to work there. And like you can build legacies within a company of this size. Yeah. And I think like having our company just aligned on that, and the fact that we understand that there's a value, it's in the model, it's baked into the model basically, that our impact as far as providing jobs and training and those things in a community like that it's something we're going to do for a long time.
And it goes back to the stranded asset conversation about, you know, in the Sandow switch. It's like, yeah, there's the physical stranded asset, but there's also people there that used to work at whether it was the aluminum plant or the coal plant, whose expertise is stranded, right? And like we're unlocking that asset as well by hiring locally, by building up our workforce in a very similar adjacency, right? Of, hey, we're doing electrical and construction.
Yeah. And I think, so Rockdale is a really good example of that because of Alcoa. So over 5,000 people, basically the whole community was in Alcoa town for a long time. And it's funny, we actually have one of the old heads there that worked for us. He was one of my first hires in Rockdale. Talk about stranded expertise, like helped us through so many on the technical side and business side. So yeah, I think a lot of times it came down to people like living there and then having to travel for work. So just like a quality of life thing of being able to work 15 minutes from home versus traveling. So, you know, it's not like everyone was out of work, right? It'd be an exaggeration to say that. But we did see some of that too. We had a lot of people who maybe didn't have the means to travel to Taylor or to Austin to go work another job, and were stuck. They had worked at Alcoa for a while, maybe in a labor position, and there were no other big industries in town to be able to provide something like that. So I think if you look at Rockdale, especially at all of the development that's even coming after us and along with us, I think it would be silly to think we didn't play a part in that, as far as like kind of stoking those flames of providing some of that energy that went into that community. And now we have somewhat of a trained workforce there that can operate.
And now next door in Taylor, you have Samsung building.
Popping right up there. Right?
Like, we're just leading the way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Samsung's following our lead here.
That's right. Yeah. That's in that model for sure.
I'm sure in Corsicana we'll get another semiconductor fab. You know, $10 billion project.
Exactly. Yeah. It's fun to think that way, at least, right? To pretend. If you.
I don't know if it's pretend. I think that we're getting there.
So Corsicana, not really the same environment there, right? They didn't have this big factory that had closed down or shuttered. But we do see a lot of people that would travel to Dallas for work, and a lot of them already telling us. So we've already started hiring there. We're building teams. A lot of them just talking about like they have more time with their family now. And I think like one of the biggest compliments you can have as far as being maybe a manager is when your employee like invites their child or their family member or cousin or something to come work for the company they're working for. There's no better signal to me that you're doing something right. And I think that is just another nod to our culture, which I think is like another big thing that's baked into this whole system is how we treat people, how we spend our money, and how we develop these sites.
My 5-year-old was like, "Hey, I want to come to the mining facility." I was like, "Let me look and see if I can find a hard hat." That
For we need some kids hard hats. Yeah.
Bring your kids to work day, just so that they can see that.
Oh yeah, we should do that.
So that's fantastic. So now in Corsicana, I think that we're doing things, some of the things in the same way, right? With Immersion, right? So, but some things we're doing very differently. Do you want to like think about, what we're doing very differently in Corsicana versus what we did in Rockdale, just because of learnings, but also just because things have changed, right? Like the industry has evolved. Micro BT has become very competitive.
Sure. Yeah. So I think even Jason touched on this in the last episode about Riot sort of being like open to just doing business in general and being business friendly. So when we completed the deployment in Rockdale, we learned a lot, right? And we took a moment to sort of write some things down and sort of think about what we learned through that process to lead us to make some good decisions in Corsicana. And one of the things we did was we explored every system we could find, and we tried to look at how the industry had changed. One is actually a fun compliment where we saw sort of some copycat action. It's like, hey, that looks a lot like what we built, right? Yeah. And I think that was like really fun for my team to see because we know we'd worked so closely on that. But I think exploring that with the vendors for the Corsicana deployment, where we ended up was things have progressed significantly. So there are so many companies now in the immersion space that are offering products, but the scale is still very much a challenge. We work so closely with Midas when they came on to do this big deployment with us that we feel like we're still seeing some struggle to compete with scale from other providers. So when we went into the Corsicana deployment, making that decision, that weighed heavy in our mind of you may have a system that looks really good, that even functions well, but if you don't have the supply chain and the network built up to support a big, fast deployment, that's tough for us, right? So I think that's what led to us making the initial 200 megawatts to go with them. And the changes we made there technically, the evolution is basically we had this tank with a pump under it, right? And then a power distribution unit that we made, and it looked almost like how we drew it on a napkin, right? Like a rectangle with some legs on it. And it's like if you took a snapshot and elevation of the tank, it looks almost just like the napkin. Now we've polished some of the edges, right? And a lot of that thinking through like deployment, we have to assemble these tanks when they come in. And guess what? Like some of them leak. And sometimes the legs, like the holes don't line up and you have to retap it. And it's not a big deal for 5 tanks. When it's 1,000 tanks, it's a big deal. It's weeks of delays and labor hours. So I think we've done a good job of, let's say, like building our jigs out in the manufacturing side and making sure we're building a simple system to install that's not going to leak, that's going to perform well. We've got lids on our tanks now. We've changed up the orientation inside of the tank so that it can accept multiple devices, which is one of our biggest challenging variables, right? In that hardware manufacturers, not only do we explore doing business with multiple manufacturers, but they change the machines and the footprints and the form factors themselves, sometimes kind of quickly.
Right.
And we'll build a system and then it'll only fit one. So we did some work towards like a more agnostic tank. And then we sort of, we took that premise to the bigger system and made our system to be able to accept other vendors' systems inside of that and be, more friendly to that type of environment that we want to build. And then on our power distribution side, we did a lot of work there. We're actually working with ESS Metron to design our own custom power distribution that integrates the network switching and all this stuff and makes it look good. So I think like we have some aesthetic improvements that I'm really excited about. But the function, the fact that these things are going to land, they're going to be palletized real nice. Like I remember our first shipments of the legs would all come in and they're tangled and they fell over in the truck. And now we have them like, it's much more thought out on this deployment. So I'm excited to see that.
They're like IKEA.
That's right. Yeah. Simple directions. I was like 3 steps to installing the tank. Yeah. And we have branding this time. So that's going to be fun. Everything's going to, look the same. So.
Fantastic. So what stage would you say Corsicana is at right now? Kind of what's the latest milestone that y'all have hit?
Sure. So the big thing we just had about 2 weeks ago, we accepted delivery of some critical the transformers for the substation. These are the transformers, the 100 megawatt transformers that feed the production, the mining buildings. And if people don't know this is sometimes up to 2 or 3 year lead times for these types of devices. So it sort of shows a little bit of what we learned from a planning standpoint and getting ahead and placing the orders and make sure we had access to these things. So those showed up a couple weeks ago, and we have 2 more showing up in October. These systems are like sort of significant to like the milestones of the project in that it can signal our transition from this planning, preparing, stockpiling all of the piping and the components that are gonna get installed on the site to the construction phase, where this crane showed up, right, and took this big hunk of steel and set it on a concrete pad.
So it's like super heavy, right?
Super heavy. Yeah, I think like 180,000 pounds, something like that. But with the setting of that device, it's for us, it's like, oh, now we have to go like install all the things that are sitting there. Just all basically the puzzle pieces are spread around the site right now. We've got to go put them all together and make sure they fit nicely together. So I think that's like an exciting transition for us and for the team, because it's sort of boots on the ground, the rubber meets the road, like all those things, right? Yeah. It's like, but the big thing I think is visually, the site's never going to look like this again. It's a big flat, pile of dirt right now. And here in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be buildings going up, and the energy is going to be ramped up, and there's going to be hundreds of people working at this site just with wrenches in their hand. And I think for me, at least, I get really excited about that. It's a fun part for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the building side, in Rockdale, we have the sprung structures for the Immersion. Do you want to tell us like the story behind those?
Sure.
And why we're not using them in Corsicana? Yeah,
sure. So, one, it's a little tough emotionally, because we had such a good experience with sprung and that process, and they really solved a key problem for us in Rockdale, which was this is COVID times again, and I think we were 38 weeks out on a metal building, and the sprungs we could get in like 8 weeks. So they came through and like completely delivered for us, and we got those buildings stood up. They look kind of like a tent structure, but they're actually really sturdy, and it's all 3M Kevlar, like really.
It's like
nice.
Military.
It's it's military grade. Yeah, and it's like So they're really sturdy buildings. They just look kind of like a tent, but so they solved this time issue that we had, which was, you're going to wait 36 weeks to mine some Bitcoin, right? It was like, go stand the thing up. And we were a little hesitant at the time, and we knew there was a risk there, right? Like our insurance process for that was pretty tough, because you see it, it's like, oh, that's a tent. And then you go through the process with the engineers and like, oh no, this is an aluminum extrusion and it's rated for this, and you can't rip the fabric, like all these things. So some complexity came with it, but what it delivered to us was a time machine, right? It got the project on faster. So we still keep them in our hearts, in the back of our minds, because we had such a good experience with them, and we knew it was a challenge for them to deliver that for us so fast. But we had a little more time in Corsicana. One of the things we rarely get on our plate, but we had a little more time, so we went with a metal building structure. And it is a little easier these days. Sprung is a bit of a newer technology, so finding someone to be able to install and erect a building like that, it's a little easier. We have more options, for the metal buildings, and people are more familiar with those. And it's engineering and insurance wise, it's a little easier process.
A known quantity, and that's a lot of metal.
Ton of metal. Yeah, all of the buildings right now are actually already on the site. Okay. So as far as the first phase, so we have 4. I think the buildings are about 1,600 feet long. They're all sitting on the site right now in pieces in like a couple of piles. So it doesn't look like much. And then eventually we're going to stand them up, and there's these massive metal building structures that are going to be up.
Fantastic. So when do you see a ribbon cutting ceremony?
Oh goodness.
Or plugging in the power?
Oh gosh, yeah. So I know we have targets. I'm always cautious as far as being a public company. I had to learn the process.
We'll edit it out.
Yeah, edit it out if you have to. No, so I think we've been really just upfront. Like we want to turn these things on at the beginning of next year. Which if you think about where we are today, we're in August, and it's just flat dirt out there. We're gonna have buildings going up in a few weeks. Towards the end of the year, we want to start receiving some of these systems and installing and testing and commissioning them. So that brings us to March, April next year. We want to plug things in and see how it goes.
Fantastic. And how many megawatts will that be in the first phase in Corsicana?
So the first phase is 400 megawatts. And then basically we commission these systems sort of back to back. Right. So our target is if in December we can receive the equipment and the machines and start installing those, we would have enough tested to where we can turn on the majority of the first 2 buildings. So that'd be 200 megawatts is our target to be able to start turning on in sort of, let's say, one run of a couple weeks to be able to get those on. So it wouldn't be, 2.5 megawatts and then a couple weeks later another 2.5. We'd be staged and ready to plug things in and go ahead.
Wow. All right. And so, I think that have you already hired all the people that are going to be working there? You have some roles that you're looking to fill?
Yeah. No, we have a bunch of roles out right now. I think I think LinkedIn is one of the ways we go out and recruit people. We also have our website with some listings up there. But yeah, no, a ton of roles, especially if anybody has any sort of construction experience. We operate a lot like a construction company, and the project management roles are always sort of wanted and growing at the company. And then we're going to have a ton of labor needed out there too, in the sense of like installing these machines and building the skills to be able to eventually maintenance and repair these machines, things of that nature. So yeah, we have a really small team right now. I think we're about 16 to 20 people total on the site. And I think that's going to look closer to the 50 range come the end of the year.
Awesome. Fantastic. Yep. Well, y'all go out on LinkedIn, send in your resume.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in the Dallas,
That's
Corsicana
right.
area.
Yeah, about 30 minutes. Yeah, 45 minutes from Dallas.
It's people aren't going to refer to it as DFW anymore. They're going to refer to it as D Corsicana.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. They follow us.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Lyle. Sure. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And looking forward to talking again soon.
Right on.